true and accurate copy of what you would have reviewed?
Yes.
Hello. So today we'll be
I have previously
covering
marked this as Exhibit 1032.
the trial of
submission.
Is this the single slide, council?
The entire program.
All right. Any objection?
Yes, Your Honor. Foundation. Bates is
the trial of George Floyd.
2971 to 21096. It's the 2020 use of force in service. Large crowd management overview.
And your objection continues?
It does, Your Honor. We just have one vote.
Yeah.
So yeah, today we're covering the trial of George Floyd.
I'm sorry, no objection?
The defense for Derek Chauvin is at the moment on cross-examination. I'm going to find out the name of this
slide 39
particular
of this, and I'd ask permission to publish.
Witness or expert.
This is the Minneapolis
So this
Police
is the
Department
LAPD
training
use
materials
of
on dealing
force
with crowds,
expert.
right?
With large crowds.
Large crowds. Crowds, officers are trained, crowds are dynamic creatures and can change rapidly.
I think his name is Jody,
Yes.
Sergeant Jody Stiger.
In this particular training for large crowds, correct.
But even in small crowds, even if you have 10 people or 12 people, crowds are dynamic creatures, right?
In certain instances, yes.
And they can change very suddenly, right?
Yes.
Just a second, Your Honor.
He's actually a pretty good defense
And I agree
lawyer.
that this deals with larger
His
crowds.
favorite quote is,
larger
and things of
protests.
that.
Yeah,
I
the
think
training
so.
is specifically for mobile field force. I'm an instructor for mobile field force as well, so yeah, I'm familiar with similar.
Things of such.
And again, officers, they are experiencing this training, right?
Yes,
And they're taught never underestimate a crowd's potential, right?
correct.
And again, crowds being unique to the particular circumstances of a particular case, right?
Correct.
And so ultimately, when an officer is on scene and he's making a decision to use force and a crowd assembles, whether they're peaceful or not peaceful, an officer, a reasonable officer, has to be aware of what they're doing, right?
Absolutely.
And that can distract an officer.
In certain instances, yes.
And as people start trying to communicate to the officers, that can take their, whether it's, even if it's just peaceful, hey, officer, hey, Sergeant Stiger, let's talk. That's distracting that officer from what he or she is doing, right?
Yes, it can.
It can.
It can.
And an officer has to be prepared for the unexpected. A reasonable officer does, right?
Yes, they're always mitigating the risk.
And I understand that part of what an officer has to do is assess the words someone may be saying and comparing it to the tone of how they're saying it, right?
Yes.
That's what a reasonable officer does, right?
Yes.
If I say, hello, Sergeant Stiger, versus, hello, Sergeant Stiger, right? There's two different tones, and my tone can convey meaning.
Yes.
Right? And if I start calling you names, that conveys a meaning, right?
Yes.
And saying things like, you're a fucking pussy, you're a bitch, that conveys a particular intent. Agreed?
I wouldn't say an intent. No.
And a reasonable officer could foresee that or see that, perceive that as a threat.
Name calling, I would say it depends on the officer's training and experience.
Okay. But an officer, a reasonable officer, could perceive the words that people are saying and the tone that it is being said in as a threat or a risk to the officer's safety.
No, they can't say
A risk-
absolutely not.
Possibly, but
Because it's not.
officers are typically trained that when it comes to verbal threats in and themselves, that you can't just use that only to justify force.
Now, you've had,
Thank
again,
you.
an opportunity to review Minneapolis Police Department's
Absolute
training
bullshit
materials.
defense.
Oh, if we could take this down, sorry.
You should just stick to the drugs thing, because this is a bullshit defense. That crowd was not a hostile crowd. It couldn't be perceived. They
Can you
were
see what's in front
pleading
of you,
for the
sir?
man's
Yes.
life.
You
Rightly
reviewed, I
so, because the
presume,
man died.
as a part of your analysis, the Minneapolis Police Department's crisis
Whether it was of a
intervention
drug
technique
overdose or
training,
it was of
right?
on the neck on the knee,
And
they
I'm
could
not
perceive
seeking
the man
to
was
admit this,
dying,
but
and then he died.
officers are trained to look at
That he
potential
needed
signs of aggression.
immediate
right?
medical
Yes.
assistance.
Minneapolis Police Department trains its
Crazy
police
to me.
officers how to potentially perceive an aggressive behavior of a person, right?
Correct.
And that includes raising voices, right?
Yes.
That includes people tensing muscles, right?
Yes.
Exaggerated gestures, pacing, right? That can be a sign of an aggressive behavior.
Yes. Typically, those are when you're dealing with your one-on-one with a specific subject or engaged in a specific call for service. That's typically when the training is given is for that, when it's more of a one-on-one, when you're dealing with a subject one-on-one.
That's the training. But in terms of now you are an officer and you're engaged with the suspect, right? And somebody else is now pacing around and watching you and calling you names
They're
and saying
filming
you're a
with a
fucking
camera.
pussy. This could be viewed by a reasonable officer as a threat.
Say no.
And in fact, when that happens, if you look at the slide in front of you, when how a person is talking to an officer, if they're mimicking them or rageful, officers are specifically trained to try to predict future behavior based on that, correct?
Yes, to prepare themselves.
Right. And when someone starts threatening you, it's a possibility that an officer can view that as a potential deadly assault is about to happen.
And then why does that mean
That's what
you
they're trained.
apply
Yes.
more
That's what
force
they're
or equal force to
Says what is
the
person's likely
person
behavior.
to the person that you're keeping under control? That doesn't mean you have to apply more or equal force to the person you're keeping under control. It makes no difference. And in fact, you de-escalate if
Now,
they're
you
asking you to
testified
do
that,
something, if you actually do it, if it's a proper
Did you
thing to
listen
do.
to every single thing that
It's
the crowd
ridiculous,
or-
a ridiculous
saying?
argument.
I attempted to, yes.
Right.
Some
I
of
suppose
you
it's a
can't
reasonable
take out, like,
doubt
for the most part,
bullshit, but like, I can't believe he's
And
dying. with this.
agree, you would
There was a
agree that
7-year-old girl in the
um,
crowd.
if someone were to say, if you touch me like that, I would like to slap the fuck out of you, right? That could be viewed as a threat.
Yes.
A threat that if you touch me again, then he's going to do something. And he's got a fucking gun. The dude's got a gun. There's
Reasonable
no
police
excuse.
officers need to,
If they
Have a
feel,
higher
if they
level
feel
of
under
awareness.
threat by a crowd,
Yes.
they pull out their gun, and the crowd will move back.
and a reasonable police officer, you would want a reasonable police officer to be more situationally aware of everything that's happening around him or her than an average bystander, right? You'd
Yes.
expect that.
Usually that comes with training, experience, and tenure.
Now, there were some questions about the actual force that was applied in this case, and it's your professional opinion, is it not, that this appears to have Officer Chauvin's knee on the neck of Mr. Floyd, right?
Yes.
And that you concluded that that was a deadly use of force, right?
Yes, based on the Mr. Floyd's actions or lack of action.
So in that context, you believe A, the knee was on the neck and applying pressure to the carotid artery?
Not necessarily in the carotid artery, but it was in the neck area and on the back.
And so as a police officer, you're trained in prone handcuffing, correct?
Correct.
You're trained in ground defense, correct?
Yes.
And ground defense includes the prone restraint technique, right?
Yes. I mean, there's other terms for it, but yes.
What would you call that? The prone restraint technique.
Well, it depends on in what context you mean.
Right. So the prone control technique, is that a
Yes.
specific term you're familiar with?
Controlling a person.
You've heard the phrase control
Attempt to
the,
handcuffing.
Let's not talk over each other.
Sorry, sir.
For the next question.
Yes, sir.
you've heard the phrase control the head, control the body.
Yes.
That's commonly what police officers are trained, right?
Yes, when it comes to
I
handcuffing.
hope the
And
jury
in
isn't
ground
falling
defense,
for this
right?
shit.
Yes.
I really
And
hope the
in
jury
the
is not
context
falling
of ground
for this crap.
defense or in
What a load of
handcuffing
bollocks.
or continuing to restrain a police or a suspect, control the head, control the body, right?
Yes, when they are resisting.
And that these concepts are widely accepted throughout law enforcement in the United States.
When they're resisting.
Yes.
And so again, in the training materials you've reviewed, you can see there are photographs, correct?
Correct.
Of officers employing a knee to the head, right?
I didn't see opportunity to the head. No.
Sometimes neck.
Near the neck area. Correct.
And the specific technique that you're trained is for an officer to put his knee into what would be the trapezius area, in between the shoulder blades at the base of the neck.
Yes,
Right?
the base of the neck.
And that is standard protocol, standard police practice, and basically in every single department that you're familiar with.
That I'm familiar with. Yes.
And you were trained that way.
Yes.
And there's the immediacy of the handcuffing, correct?
Correct.
And then there's the need to continue to control the suspect, correct? If they're resisting.
Yes.
And then there is simply holding someone or restraining them to decide what your next steps are going to be, right?
Yes. In most cases, however, especially in the last 20 years, officers are trained to, once you handcuff the person, even if they are still resisting, you still want to try to put them in a somewhat of a side recovery position or sit them up.
Even if they're still resisting.
Yes. And hold them down in the side recovery position or utilize a hobble.
You would agree that the Minneapolis Police Department are trained that when a person is handcuffed and then rendered unconscious, that officers need to use caution in unhandcuffing them to revive them?
No, I'm not familiar with that. No.
Did you, as a part of your analysis, review any training materials regarding the use of the lateral vascular neck restraint?
Yes.
Just looking in front of you, did you look at this training material?
Yes.
By the way, I'm not just against the defense. I'm not, that's not my
Officers are trained that
point
a
here.
CPR
I
is
actually
needed.
think this line of questioning is
Remove handcuffs
nonsense.
first, right?
Correct.
And to use caution because the subject may revive agitated and ready to fight.
Correct.
You've had that training too?
Yes.
You've had that experience where someone is rendered unconscious, is revived, and fights you more?
Not that they passed out and then they came to. Yes.
And then they fought you more?
Yes.
Interesting.
Looking at what's already in evidence, the 2019 use of force manual at slide 41. this is what we're talking about in terms of the prone arm control, right?
Yes,
And you see a photograph here. Officer's knee appears to be across into the shoulder blades and between the shoulder blades across the head and neck area of the person, right?
yes, as he's attempting to handcuff the person, yes.
Your Honor, not an objection, but just a thought. Would you please identify?
That was, I have it listed as 1031, or that's what I had it. You were, I don't remember what you were.
That's a 2019.
2019 use of force. Sorry. I'm referring to bait stamp 21464 was the 2019 defensive tactics that you introduced. Sorry.
We just take a brief pause. Sorry.
It's a fascinating case, though. I mean, like, really, it's quite interesting. I think for the most part, the defense has done a much better job, and they've got a pretty uphill struggle. There were a couple of, one of the good things about this is about what the defense's strategy is, and I don't know if it's a strategy or it's just because Chauvin can't afford another lawyer, but he's really covering everything, this one lawyer, and he's a very competent guy on the defense side. However, having
Your
said
Honor,
that,
this is from Exhibit 126, which is already in evidence. It asks.
he's not very convincing
permission
to
to
me.
publish.
It's just that across
Again,
the
you
board,
see
he's
here,
doing a very
this
good job
officer's
of
knee
cross-examination.
Over the neck
And I can
head
see some
of the
people
subject as he's
falling.
attempting to handcuff him, correct?
Correct.
And so there are circumstances when the knee is put in this position, correct?
Yes, but officers are always cautioned to try to stay away from the neck as much as possible.
All right. We can take that down here. Now, you were
There's a
shown
problem I
series,
have with every
of
single
photographs,
aspect of this defense.
comparative photographs.
That means
I just don't have a
that
copy of that right now.
Chauvin is
I believe
still
it was exhibit
criminally
2.
responsible for the death of George Floyd. And I want to ask some questions. I'm hoping that maybe some lawyers or something might come across this and be able to answer some questions for me on this whole defense, because I just think that there's something about
There
this
was
that
one
is totally
photo.
misguided and wrong and shouldn't even be allowed to be considered, especially the drug overdose defense.
The photo, if we could publish
Because I
this,
think it's irrelevant if he was having a drug overdose
in
or
this
not, given
upper
the
right-hand
actions
corner,
of Derek Chauvin.
right?
Yes.
And I'm not just saying that because,
Mr.
I'm
Chauvin,
saying I
the
actually
right
genuinely
shoulder
believe
is
that
down
if you
lower,
reason
right,
the
than the left
evidence
shoulder.
of
Yes.
what happened.
And that would be consistent with more of his weight being on his right side, correct?
Yes.
We can take that down. And again, when we look at still photographs, what we miss is sort of the dynamics of what's happening, right?
Yes.
So weight can be shifting from side to side at times,
Correct.
right? And if an officer is generally speaking on his toes, the majority of the weight is going to be in the feet, right? That's what you're trained.
Yes, that's how officers are trained.
And so if his left leg, his foot is off to the side, he has no weight, or he has less weight on that side of his body because his foot is off to the side, right?
Yes.
And if his right foot, the toes are tucked under, that would be consistent with having the majority of the weight on the right side, right?
Yes.
And again, in uses of force that you've used yourself,
That's a good
or
point.
uses of force that you have reviewed, right? Oftentimes, these things, uses of force, leave injuries on a suspect, right?
Yes.
And if the weight of a human being was placed in a particular area based on your training and experience at reviewing police uses of force, you would expect there to be injury where the majority of the weight exists, right?
Objection, Your Honor. Lack of foundation of the officer.
Overruled. You may.
Not necessarily, no.
But obviously, medical doctors may be able to answer that better, right?
Correct.
You would agree that on May 25th of 2020, Minneapolis Police Department authorized the use of neck restraints, right?
Correct.
And that the conscious neck restraint was not considered a lethal use of force.
Correct.
So I would like to show you a series of photographs that were introduced yesterday, starting with exhibit 1045. So before we go there, you would agree that some of the problems with photographs are that, again, it doesn't capture, a single photograph isn't going to capture the dynamics of what's happening, right?
It was
In some
video.
cases, yes.
Weight can shift, right?
Correct.
In a video versus a still photograph. Right?
Yes.
And positions can change, right?
Yes.
And those things can happen throughout the course of the time of use of force, right?
Yes.
Now, I'd like to show you and publish exhibit 1045. I don't know if you've seen these, but these are stills from the body-worn camera. Oh, sorry. It's a little difficult to see through the glare here, but maybe you can see it better on
They
your
should do
screen.
the glove experiment like in O.J.
Feel free.
Simpson, where
Thank you, sir.
they just get
In this
somebody
area
to
here, it
kneel
appears that you can see
on
Officer
Derek
Chauvin's
Chauvin's neck
left
for just
leg,
2-3 minutes. See how he does.
Yes.
and that Officer Chauvin's chin appears to be sort of parallel to or over Mr. Floyd's left shoulder blade. Agreed?
It's hard to tell. It could be
Exactly.
his
Exactly.
neck
That's
or shoulder blade.
In this dip right in here, the area between the two shoulder blades, he's handcuffed, right? That causes the shoulders to sort of come back.
I'm sorry, you're referring to his left knee, correct? That's
Right.
what you stated, his left knee?
Right.
Yes, his left knee appears to be, based on the photograph I'm looking at, near the neck area of Mr. Floyd.
In between the shoulder blade here and what would be the shoulder blade behind his hand.
Above it. I wouldn't say it was in between it. It's more, it looks like it appears to be more above the shoulder blades than it does on the shoulder blades or below it.
Almost resting on the shoulder blade.
Above.
above the shoulder
would say
blades.
above, yes.
All right.
Yeah,
It appears to
exactly.
be
That's what
angled
the
in
other
towards
guy
the
said. The
cruiser,
wrong
correct?
thing. It
Yes.
wasn't there. You can see. You can't.
Showing you, oops,
You can't fucking
I'll
see that.
Play that again. That being at 2023-32, right?
Yes.
Complete bullshit. He's trying to make it like it's on the shoulder blade. You can't see it from that photo. He showed another photo and he was saying about
Again, you can see
the
Mr. Floyd's shoulder
photo
blade here a
bias
little
or
bit more
whatever.
pronounced.
Yes.
Like photography
Appears to be
bias.
above the shoulder blade, correct? Mr. Chauvin's, Mr. Floyd's shoulder blade is a little more pronounced. Mr. Chauvin's shin appears to be, or calf, appears to be above the shoulder blade,
Correct.
Yes.
angled in towards the squad car, correct?
Slightly, yes.
Showing you 1047. This is now 2027. Appears to be a different angle now, right?
Yes.
And you can get a much clearer view of the placement of Mr. Chauvin's knee.
Yes.
And again, here you've got the shoulder blade shoulder blade, Mr. Chauvin's knee is sort of at the base of the neck, right?
Correct, I would agree.
Yeah, okay, that's true.
And looking finally at Exhibit 1048. You can see Mr. Floyd's head in this picture, correct?
Yes,
And it gives you, again, a depth perception of the placement of Mr. Chauvin's knee relative to the neck of Mr. Floyd.
somewhat, yes.
Now,
There-
we can take this
There's a
down
problem
one.
with this though, which is that George Floyd said the knee's on my neck. He was saying the knee is on my
To
neck.
show you what has been
I can't breathe, his knee is on my neck.
as
That's the
Exhibit
problem.
1020,
And when he passed out, that is what he was saying before.
which on the
My neck
left-hand
hurts.
side of your screen, you see that appears to be the bystander video.
Yes,
On the right-hand side, that's from Mr. King's body-worn camera.
And you can't
Yes.
see where the knee is. You cannot see where the knee is. The hand is above the knee, so you cannot see that.
You'd agree that at this point, based on everything that we've seen in the same photographs, on the left-hand side, it appears that Mr. Chauvin's knee is on Mr. Floyd's neck.
yes.
You cannot tell the hand is
More
on the
base of the neck.
And from Officer King's body-worn camera, it appears that it was more at the base of the neck, in between the shoulder blades, right?
Yes,
And in fact, as you review some of the videos, while Mr. Floyd was in the prone position, there are points in time at which Mr. Floyd picks up his head and moves it. Agreed?
he attempted to early on, yes. He was stating he couldn't breathe, so I assumed he was attempting to try to breathe better.
But he was able to lift up his head at some points, turn it. correct?
Slightly, yes, he attempted to.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Redirect.
That was at the last minute. That's all they can show of the body cam to demonstrate this. This is, and it's not clear where his knee was or at what point he was. The guy had already passed out by then.
Sir, to clarify a little bit on the, thank you. To clarify a little bit on the known risk that you testified to with respect to positional asphyxia.
Yes,
Is the risk related to the pressure on the neck or the pressure on the body?
this the pressure on the body. Any additional pressure on the body complicates breathing more so than if there was no pressure at all.
And so the placement of the knees, even if there can be shifting between the neck, the base of the neck, the point is that both of the defendant's knees were on Mr. Floyd's body during the entirety of the restraint period. Is that right?
Yes,
And it was on
I'm
the
gonna,
neck, by the way.
Ask you
But
some
anyway,
questions about what
good question.
may have been apparent to the defendant when he first got on the scene. You were asked some questions about being dispatched, and you know the term code 4, correct?
correct.
And were you aware that prior to the defendant arriving on the scene, that Officer Lane had called code 4?
Yes, I believe so. And reviewing some of the documentation and things of that nature.
And what does that mean?
That means that everything is okay. That we have
Things of that nature.
So
that's
at least
what
at the
it-
time the
that's what
defendant
it is.
arrived, he would have been aware, based on the totality, that code 4 had been called.
Yes,
I'd like to direct your attention to the moment in time when he would have arrived. You can pull Exhibit 43 which is, for the record, Officer Lane's body-worn camera. And I'd like you to begin displaying at timestamp 2017:20. I'm sorry, can't hear you. Hold on. Apologize. 47. If- All right. Well, we see it at, you can leave it at 20 or where it was. Yeah, go ahead. All right. So we see in the still frame, and now for the record, the timestamp is 2017:20. At this point in time, we see Officer Tao, and would have been next to him, the defendant, arrive. Is that right?
Yes, I believe you can see his shoulder and the circle that you have.
And I'd ask to begin publishing to the jury.
Wait, I'm not trying to win. I'm not trying to win. I'll get on the ground or anything. I can't stand this shit, man. He know it. He know it. Okay, can I talk to you, please?
Yes, you get in this car, we can talk.
I'm claustrophobic.
I'm hearing you, but you're not working with me.
God, I'm claustrophobic, man.
Get in the
Why don't you
car.
go over here? I'm gonna pull you
Get
in.
in the
Can you
car.
put me in the front, please?
No, you're not getting in the
I'm
car.
claustrophobic. I was
Get in the car.
Okay, man, okay. I'm not a bad guy,
Get
man.
in the car.
I'm not a bad guy. Man.
Now, and you can take that down. Sir, in assessing an individual in the totality of the circumstances that would have been apparent at the scene, were you able to detect any indication that Mr. Floyd was under some sort of distress?
Based on his comments and based on his actions, yes, it was a possibility.
And is that something that would have, apparently, Officer Chauvin, the defendant, would have seen that? Is that correct?
Yes,
And would a reasonable officer have taken that into account?
yes.
Right, exactly.
Now, sir, you testified that the force that was used here during the restraint period by the defendant was in fact excessive. Is that right?
Yes.
And you were asked on cross to distinguish between the standard, or to comment on the standard of objectively reasonable force. Is it your opinion then, to a degree of professional certainty, that the force you've identified as applied by the defendant during the restraint period, was it objectively reasonable or not objectively reasonable?
It was not objectively reasonable.
And is that then the basis for saying it was excessive?
Correct.
You were asked about different techniques for de-escalation and the telling of someone to relax. I'd like you to comment on the context in which Mr. Floyd was told to relax by the defendant.
It appeared in the video that he was told to relax as he was stating that he was in a medical distress. He couldn't breathe and that he was in pain.
And so, again, the context, the words of the defendant versus the actions, telling someone to relax when you're sitting on top of them, is that an effective de-escalation technique in your opinion?
Overruled. Opinion.
Not necessarily.
What do you mean, not necessarily? Why are you saying not necessarily?
As to
Just say no.
an officer, a reasonable officer,
What's wrong
reassessing
with
and
this guy?
reevaluating the situation, they also have to take in information related to a subject's potential
And
medical
why
condition.
do
Is that
they
right?
give these
Yes.
short,
Do you
stupid
agree with the
answers?
statement?
He gave you
In
an
your custody,
open
in your
question.
care?
Yes,
he's
what
sick,
does that
you're,
mean?
you're kneeling on a
It
guy's
means
neck
once you take someone
and you're telling him
into
to
custody,
relax.
then you're responsible for
How are they
their
going to relax if you're
And can
kneeling on
you,
their
as an
fucking
officer,
neck?
simply opt not to believe them?
Unfucking believable.
No.
Why don't you just say
You have to
that?
consider the context, correct?
Correct.
And
We're obligated to in most cases.
I'm sorry, I cut you off. Could you please repeat that?
I'm sorry, Your Honor. You're obligated to. It's part of your duty.
And in the context that you saw here, in which Mr. Floyd was manifesting some distress, did you believe the defendant have an obligation to at least take that into consideration in the totality of circumstances when considering to continue the type of force he was applying?
Absolutely. As the time went on, clearly in the video, you could see that Mr. Floyd's his health was deteriorating. His breath was getting lower. His tone of voice was getting lower. His movements were starting to cease. So at that point, as a officer on scene, you have a responsibility to realize that, okay, something is not right. Something has changed drastically from what was occurring earlier. So therefore, you have a responsibility to take some type of action.
Sir, you were shown some
Wow,
training
a full
materials,
fucking
that
answer.
included photographs of
Jeez.
officers in positions
would have
in
known
which
you
they
were
would have
capable
their
of such a
legs
thing.
on the subject's back.
Fuck me, man.
base of
Yes,
the neck,
no,
is that
yeah.
right?
Yes.
Answer
In
the
the photograph
fucking
you were
question.
shown, that subject was not yet handcuffed, was he?
No, he was not.
And the purpose of situating oneself on a subject is to gain control in order to handcuff the individual.
Yes.
And what is the officer supposed to do after they handcuff the individual?
Immediately sit the person up or put him in a side recovery position.
You were asked to comment on sort of the notion that some things that law enforcement have to do, uses of force, are not attractive to the public. Is that right?
Correct.
And in fact, you were asked about a presentation that you had given relative to that called, was it Awful But Lawful?
Yes.
And to be lawful, the force must be objectively reasonable, correct?
Correct.
And if it isn't lawful, then what's left?
Well, the whole premise of the presentation was that in certain situations, based on a policy or a particular law, even though the situation may be deemed lawful in the community's eyes, and the use of force is awful. So it was stating that, hey, in these situations, you can have a situation where by law it looks horrible to the common eye, but based on the state law, it's lawful.
But if it's not objectively reasonable and it's not lawful, then it's just awful.
Correct.
Nothing further.
Jesus Christ, this guy can't answer a question. Does he listen and then just, I don't understand why, like he had to ask him and prompt him again to actually answer the question that he gave. He's saying, sorry guys, I'm sorry I'm getting angry at this witness.
The day of,
But he was asking if it's unreasonable,
You would not have
then it doesn't fall
known how
into
people
the
were
lawful,
feeling,
awful kind of
you would not know
formulation
how
that he just
they
gave,
felt
or that he
in
was
terms
giving
of
during
their
this
perception, correct?
Correct.
presentation that he
know
gave ages ago.
How
It's
Mr. Floyd's
unreasonable
body
force.
felt at that moment, correct?
only what he was verbalizing.
I'm talking about in terms of the stiffness or tension of his body.
Correct.
And again, in terms of your use of force reviews in the past, you said you're a peer reviewer. How many reviewers look at an incident in the terms of a use of force?
From start to finish, numerous. So in Los Angeles Police Department, it starts with the sergeant who's doing the investigation. Then from there, it will go to the watch commander, who happens to be typically a lieutenant or another sergeant. and the training coordinator. Then they make recommendations, and then they send it to the captains of the division. And at that point, the captains would then send it to the bureau. And that's where I was at one point as well. And the bureau makes recommendations, and then it gets sent up to another unit, and they make the final recommendation in that. In regards to more serious ones where I was a peer member, it goes from the investigators to the Use of Force Review Board, which is a 5-member board, 4 command staff and a peer.
And that peer review board, the 5 people, they make recommendations to move up the chain, right?
Yes, so they make recommendations. I'm sorry.
No, I was
Okay.
itching my face.
They make recommendations to the chief of police, then the chief of police reviews it, and he makes recommendations to the police commission. And the inspector general's office also reviews all the evidence as well, and they make recommendations. In most cases, they concur with the chief. In some cases, they disagree. And then finally, a presentation is made to the police commission, and the police commission at that point makes the final decision.
So there's layers of review, right?
Correct.
And ultimately, in terms of just that 5-member review board, right, the one that you were describing,
Right.
Are those decisions always unanimous
No,
as to whether or not it was a reasonable use of force?
no, it's not.
And sometimes those 5 people, they may disagree with each other, right?
Yes, we have a something what we call a minority report. I've actually written a couple of those myself. But yes, if one person or a number of people on that board will disagree, then that the ones that disagree, the minority have to do a report, basically telling what their case is and why they disagree.
Right. So even within that process, there is 5 potential police officers who can disagree with each other.
Correct.
All right. I have no further questions.
All right, thank you, Sergeant.
Thank you, sir.
We appreciate your time. You are excused.
Thank you.
Let's do one more witness at least start.
Yeah, sorry I was getting emotional there. It's just because I find that I understand that you have to get succinct, give succinct answers, but I feel that often these, experts aren't, they're too careful. And I've seen cases where the experts really give full answers when they're given open questions. When you're given an open question, you need to take advantage of that to make your
Thanks
case.
to all our viewers from around the country and around the
unless
world
you don't
for
care, of
continuing
course, either
to
way.
join us here.
But,
We are now listening
if you
to
do
a new
care
witness
and you're
coming
putting
up to
forward
the stand
a
here. It
position,
looks like it's a
then
special
you should
agent
take
talking
the
about the
opportunity
investigation
from an
into
open
the
question that a
George Floyd
lawyer
death.
gives
Oh,
you
let's listen right
to
here on News Now
really
from
give
Fox.
as much of an open answer as you possibly can.
James, James, Ryerson, REY.
And also, when you've got a close question that you're answering in the negative, which means you're allowed to kind of explain yourself, then you should also take full advantage of that.
Just in general, what does a senior special agent do? What does your job entail?
So I'm currently assigned to the newly formed Use of Force investigation group. We conduct criminal investigations into uses of force incident.
Are you a licensed peace officer?
Yes, sir.
Obviously, you're not wearing what we typically think of as a police uniform. Is that, when you work, do you have a uniform?
Generally, no. Generally plain clothes.
Okay. And you mentioned, when did you first become licensed as a peace officer?
I started my law enforcement career in 2007.
And so let's run through your education and work experience for your job as a peace officer. First of all,
As a peace officer,
obtain like a 4-year undergraduate degree.
I did.
Can you describe or tell the jury what that is?
I have a Bachelor's of Science in Criminology from the University of Tampa
What year did you achieve that?
in 2006.
And after that, did you go to work in the field of law enforcement?
I did.
Where were you first hired to work in law enforcement?
I started my career at the New York City Police Department, the NYPD.
And so did you do some training then to be an NYPD officer?
I did. The NYPD has a 6-month training academy that I successfully completed.
And is that when you then obtained your license to be a peace officer?
Yes, sir.
And that was about what year?
approximately 2007.
And when you became, well, let me ask you this, how many years did you work for the NYPD?
Approximately 4.5.
And can you describe for the jurors, in what capacity you worked as a peace officer in New York City?
So as a police officer, initially assigned to the 32nd Precinct in Harlem, New York, my initial duties were as an impact officer, interacting with the community, addressing kind of quality of life issues. I was then transferred to Manhattan North Task Force as a task force officer. From there, I was assigned to address quality of life issues as well as violent crime issues, narcotics, and guns.
So all that time spent on the streets, essentially.
Correct.
And at some